I'm a refugee from Ukraine. I'm not Ukrainian, but I have lived in Ukraine for 16 years, and I've recently escaped Ukraine because of the war. So now I'm kind of watching what people think about the whole war and how much of a brain that takes industry is growing around Ukraine. And again, my best guess would be that people don't know. But anyway, let's see what Mr. Brand has to say. I'm not a fan of Russel Brand, I guess. He's one of those celebrities that are just celebrities for celebrity's sake, I guess, like Paris Hilton. So maybe a male version of Paris Hilton, I don't know. So let's jump in.
If Tucker Carlson, who's a libertarian on the right, can't
Okay, I appreciate the energy. Tucker Carlson is not libertarian by any definition of that word. So let's go.
speak, and Noam Chomsky, who's a kind of radical leftist, can't speak, then who can speak? And who's benefiting from all this not speaking stuff? Have a guess.
We're going into
Hello there, you
conspiracy right away.
5.5 million awakening wonders. Together we voyage into the unknown, but not the unknowable. New territories will emerge as the light grows brighter. Rest assured of that. If you're not a subscriber yet, subscribe now. Only half of you subscribe. I love seeing that number flying up. It gives old Russ just some comfort. Also, if you're not a subscriber to my mailing list yet, you should subscribe to that, because I'm doing a one-day event with Wim Hof, July the 10th. It will only be available to people that subscribe to my mailing list. Live with Wim Hof. That's
He's
gonna
good
be
with
amazing,
marketing,
isn't it?
though.
Who gets to speak now? Who is permitted to express an opinion? What opinions are forbidden? Who gets censored? Who's ultimately determining which voices thrive, survive, and are censored, cut? This is by Matt Taibbi. You should subscribe to his Substack. He's fantastic. Noam Chomsky gave an interview to Current Affairs last week called How to Prevent World War III. You think...
Okay, so we talked about this a little bit already. So we're on kind of familiar territory. All of these people are, repeating the same talking points, but let's see what Russell has to say.
People would be interested in that, unless you want World War III for some mad reason. There are two options with regard to Ukraine, as we know. One option is a negotiated settlement, which will offer Putin an escape, an ugly settlement. Is it within reach? We don't know. You can only find out by trying, and we're refusing to try. But that's one option. I refuse to try. I know people.
We're not refusing to try. There were negotiations with Russia. They failed because Russia's conditions were pretty much, okay, sure, our conditions are you guys surrender and then we can negotiate. So I don't think that you could call those very useful negotiations.
Whose opinions I respect. They say Putin, he's a rare kind of nutter. He's an out there tyrant. He won't rest till he's took over the world. We have to crush him at all costs. And my only concern about that kind of extreme perspective is, isn't that exactly what the most powerful voices in media, government, and the corporate world are saying? I'm always circumspect, sometimes skeptical. I try not to be cynical about those voices, but when I find myself agreeing with the most powerful institutions in the world, I always check on myself before I wreck myself. The other
Okay, so yeah, this is pretty much the usual conspiracy stuff. I'm not going to comment, I guess.
other option is to make it explicit and clear to Putin and the small circle of men around him that you have no escape, you're going to a war crimes trial no matter what you do. Boris Johnson just reiterated this. Sanctions will go on no matter what you do. What does that mean? It means go ahead and obliterate Ukraine and go on to lay the basis for a terminal war. Those are the two options, and we're picking the second and praising ourselves for heroism and doing it, fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. It's an interesting point that...
That's kind of true. I mean, no NATO countries are directly involved. No NATO soldiers will die in this war, hopefully. And it's just Ukrainians that are dying. And of course, Russians, a lot of them. So NATO is pretty much fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. I guess that's true.
Chomsky makes, because of course it costs us very little to put up some flags and that and say, go Ukraine, because I'm not...
I mean, financially, it costs a lot to support Ukraine, of course.
In no war. I would like a peaceful outcome for Ukrainian people above all else, because it seems that's where the centre of the suffering is. And as Chomsky, who I believe has some credentials when commentating on these matters, says you have to look at what options are available and consider.
Google Chomsky on Yugoslavia, his takes on the Serbian. I think he was directly commenting on Milosevic. I'm not sure. Maybe he wasn't. But I do remember that he was against NATO bombing and things like that. That's a completely, of course, separate conversation, but it gives you some perspective to how credentialed Chomsky is.
Consider all options. Immediate shrieking outrage, of course, ensued. Chomsky was judged as a genocide-enabling, America-hating Kremlin stooge. We're certainly not comparing ourselves to Chomsky after his great contributions to culture, but we've had our own pushback and criticism for...
Is that a royal we? I guess it was. Yeah, I mean, Chomsky is entitled to his opinion. I don't think people piling on is very cool.
Simply trying to explain the complexity of the situation in Ukraine, and have had to continually refer to the refrain, to explain is not to condone. Just trying to understand the situation. Couldn't be more sympathetic about, well, could be more sympathetic. I could be an actual Ukrainian person or have people that I love actually there. But if you're a person that's been watching the news for the last 20 years, you know that wars have happened in the past and they've been dubiously underwritten. And perhaps this is different. I don't know.
I mean, of course, Russia is... when was the last time that Russia was losing in an open war against another country? Do you remember that time when that happened? I don't.
No, but I wouldn't just go, oh no, they're saying it's different this time, the guys that did all the lying last time, so I'm cool with that. It's getting to the point where unless you toe the line, your voice is not welcome. That's not a healthy democratic discourse. I think it's good to communicate with people that you don't agree with. I make a point of having conversations with people and saying, oh yeah, why do you believe in that? Oh, okay, that's it. I've learned that way. I've changed my opinion. I've become a better person, a more open person. I've learned that I believed in stuff that simply wasn't true, that I've done things that weren't right. That's how I've grown. The interesting thing about Chomsky's Ukraine comments wasn't even that they were so inflammatory, but that he was giving them to current affairs. The hits and traffic for Chomsky's controversy-generating interview could have belonged to the New York Times, Washington Post, or even MSNBC. However, in this country, when it comes to war, big media companies simply do not air countervailing views, not even out of economic self-interest. That's so interesting, because economic self-interest is a powerful part of the deal. But I guess...
So I'm not sure if this is actually true, and this seems like just conjecture on Taibbi's part, so I don't know.
The way that they are structured and funded more generally prohibits them going against those broader interests. Who sits on the board of these organisations? What conglomerates are they part of? What sets of interests are represented in those kind of corporate areas? Before deplatforming was even a term in the American consciousness...
Many people claim this and show the example of the Iraq War, when there was this whole manufacture of consent thing for the war. And I believe New York Times was, or was it Washington Post? I don't remember, but there was a lot of pretty much pro-war propaganda without a lot of evidence for the Iraq War by the mainstream media. I think that's probably the strongest argument against any kind of censorship, because, of course, if you were against the Iraq War, which seems to be a correct position right now, you would be censored very likely by the information czars, by the ministries of truth, or whatever they would be called. So there's some merit to saying that, sure, the mainstream media have their own agenda, but I think it's much worse than people think. I don't think it's actually malice or any kind of conspiracy that's motivated by some political agenda, although that's a factor for sure. I think that people generally mean well, or like to think that they mean well, or rationalize what they're doing in some way that appears to them as if they are doing well. So, doing good. So, I think that it's usually like that. It's kind of a mass hysteria kind of thing where people kind of just push each other more and more in a single direction, and this kind of groupthink starts to take place. I mean, let's look at the situation before the war, before Russia invaded. We had intelligence services telling us what was actually the truth, right? They were telling us that Russia will invade, and they were giving us dates. Okay, those dates were not super precise. They were wrong about the dates, maybe, or maybe Russia just changed plans based on what the Western intelligence was reporting. But basically, they were giving us the truth. However, they told us, well, we can't explain how we know this, and we can't tell you what the sources are, and we can't actually provide any evidence. And there was a journalist that was kind of making fun of all of this and saying, okay, but how do we know that after the debacle in Iraq, how do we know that, that you're just not lying, that you're not making this up? And that's a difficult thing to process, even though, from one hand, you have these intelligence agencies that were correct in this case. They may not be correct next time. They have not been correct several of the last times, and they never provide any kind of verifiable evidence, arguably because of the nature of their job. So sure, that's kind of understandable. It kind of is hard to believe them, is what I'm trying to say. And what Russell is saying here, I think, which is it's really hard to believe those information sources that are anonymous, confidential, etc., and then the mainstream media who unconditionally believe those sources. It's kind of, okay, well, we trust you, tell us what's going on. I mean, they're often wrong. They're not always right. If anything, this was an exception, a very good, surprising exception that the intelligence services are actually doing their job well, but it was an exception.
Our corporate press perfected it with regard to war critics. Back in May of 2003, months into the Iraq war invasion, the media watchdog FAIR did a study of 1,617 on-camera sources cited on 6 television networks and came to remarkable conclusions. Anti-war voices were 10% of all sources, but just 6% of non-Iraqi sources and just 3% of US sources, the group noted. Of a total of 840 sources who are current or former government or military officials, only 4 were identified as holding anti-war opinions. That's not a balanced representation, is it? If only 4 of 844 people had anti-war opinions. Because anti-war, that's generally speaking an important sentiment, isn't it? Broadly speaking, you think of people like, Gandhi and Martin Luther King and just the concept of Jesus. There's some pretty powerful anti-war voices out there. Fair.
So this was pretty dumb. The anti-war doesn't mean that people want that people who are not quote unquote anti-war like war or they're pro-war. Everybody wants the war to end. It's a matter of how we do that. What is the best way to end it? And most people seem to believe that in Ukraine's case, the best way to end the war is to defeat Russia. And we can clearly define what that means. That doesn't have to be killing Putin, toppling his regime, invading Russian territory, starting Third World War. None of that. Doesn't have to be that at all. It can just be kicking him out of Ukrainian territory. That's a well-defined, clear, achievable goal. That seems to be the most efficient thing we can do in terms of ending the war. The Russians do not seem to want to end the war in any other way. It doesn't matter what we want. It doesn't matter that we want to negotiate. They're not willing to do that. Their conditions were and still are pretty much unconditional surrender. They're requiring Ukraine to demilitarize itself, which is basically dropping the weapons to the floor and surrendering. And, those are not nice conditions to start negotiation with.
Found that there was a literal absolute consensus about war among the major centre-left stations, ABC, CBS, NBC and CNN, almost 20 years ago. That's astonishing, isn't it? Like the left, with its assumed connection to fairness, justice, progress, and surely progress above all else should be progression in the direction of peace and harmony, freedom of individual expression, freedom internationally, freedom globally, freedom to be who you are, freedom to live with the ability to speak freely, free from fear. This is surely what the left should be doing. Authoritarianism in any guise ought to be labelled as authoritarianism. We shouldn't say, but this one's got a nice flag on it. It's just authoritarianism. You can utilise it however you want to. It doesn't matter if you're presenting it in a particularly attractive light. Since then, we've only widened the rhetorical no-fly zone.
I didn't quite follow the argument about authoritarianism. There was consensus, sure, but again, that consensus was pretty much, I think, supported by each other, supported by all the media, kind of pushing each other in the same direction of what we now know was a totally incorrect war, totally invalid reasons for the war. In this case, I think we're having the same thing by the media. The media are pretty much repeating the same thing, and there is nobody mainstream that is saying what Russell is saying, even close to that, I think. I don't like that either. I don't think it's good that people who definitely believe that, and I'm sure there's a ton of people who believe that, are basically left unchallenged by the fact that they have to be quiet, and that they would be censored, that they would be shut up, that they would be suppressed. I don't think they'll stop thinking what they're thinking just because we don't allow them to speak. So if anything, it's useful that people can speak about this. And it's very important, of course, from people who like to be right to challenge them on those opinions, because they're obviously wrong in many ways. But before you can be challenged, you have to express your opinion.
In a development that back then I would have bet my life on never happening, anti-interventionist voices or advocates for such people are increasingly confined to Fox if they appear on major corporate media at all. Those of you that have been fans of this channel for a long while will see that like 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, we were doing videos where like we'd rile up Bill O'Reilly. Look at Bill O'Reilly, the daft old bugger. Or look at Sean Hannity, the soppy old sod. Teasing them for their crazy corporatist, right-wing, toe-the-line, dumb views. And like sometimes it's pretty good fun to do it, and it was a hoot. But now you're much more likely to hear dissenting voices on Fox News than the networks just listed. So if we don't adjust our perspective in alignment with actual change, then there's a word for that. That's dogma. That means, no, I like them. I like their branding. It's not a football team. No, my dad was a fan of MSNBC. My granddad was a fan of MSNBC. Oh, in the old days, we used to go and sit round and watch MSNBC on a wooden television, tooting our horns, waving our little wooden rattles. Come on, you MSNBC, we'd say. It's just a corporate medium that just conveys government and state information with the broad idea that it will somehow deaden you to reality and make you a compliant little numbskull. And from what I see, it's working pretty well. This begins with those who are literally...
So he's off on a tangent. I don't think this is directly related to what we're talking about. Fox News, if anything, is telling people what they want to hear, just like MSNBC is telling people what they want to hear. And of course, there's a lot of people who would like to hear something that's not on the liberal side, and that's why Fox News is super successful. And there's nothing wrong with that. Sure, we can be tribal about those things, of course, but that's not directly connected with truth, is it? I mean, you can have people saying truth on both sides. You can have people on Fox News, in theory, telling you the truth, just like you can have them on MSNBC. And the opposite, I think, is, valid too. Although my guess would be that there is more misinformation on Fox News, but honestly, I'm not really sure about that. That's something that's pretty hard to verify or check.
Literal exiles or de facto political prisoners like Edward Snowden or Julian Assange, and continues through the growing list of people like Cy Hirsch or Australian filmmaker John Pilger. John Pilger, like 20 years ago, he was like Uncle John Pilger, like we all loved him. Oh, John Pilger, he's a news reporter, he's a gonzo journalist, he's been in wars, he'll tell you the score about the Middle East. People used to go and see him in his camo shorts and that to hear proper journalism. Now this dude can't even get on the television. So what's happened? There has been an advancement. There has been a progress. And this sort of cultural censorship must be part of the intention of the state. I can't really understand it. It's too confusing for me. But I think it creates a stymieing social environment where people are uncertain about how to communicate and about ever-shifting rules. And it prevents alliances and easy conviviality between peoples who basically have the same interests from forming. Like, think about you yourself, when you're out in the world, you're all right, aren't you? You're meeting people, all right, mate, how's it going? You're chatting to people. Oh, yeah, you're not like, I don't like you, you're probably gay, are you? I don't know, what colour are you? That's not what's going on in your mind, is it? That's what's going on in this sort of hive mind that's been externally imposed, separated from one another, bludgeoned from our compassion, separated from our natural reason, our natural tendency towards unity. Or then,
what the hell is he talking about? Somebody explain. If anything, this suppression, I mean, there's dominance of liberals in the media, and there's suppression of anything that they don't like pretty much in the mainstream media. This has forced the conservatives to go to social networks. Again, we have Fox News. I don't think they're without a voice unless you're demanding that they're represented on the on the mainstream media, left-wing CNNs, MSNBCs, etc. CNN is kind of trying to represent old school Republicans, but the modern Republican Party I don't think is well represented at all on the left-wing media. I don't think that has caused conservative people to feel threatened in any way, other than maybe just despise what they see on TV and what people generally in cities and liberal centers think. But I don't think it has caused what Russell is talking about. He sounds like he sounds like somebody who's talking about suppression on an individual level, like when you go outside, you feel insecure about what you're gonna say. I don't think that's happening at all.
Denis Kucinich or Tulsi Gabbard, all of whom have been put on pay no mind lists for views on Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, and other actual potential military interventions. The fact that there is a list, you know what I mean, it shows you it's institutional, doesn't it? It's not like...
Yeah, that's pretty fair. I mean, those people are on a kind of no talk list in the liberal media, but Tulsi is going to Fox News all the time. She's talking to Joe Rogan, who has a large audience, so she definitely can talk about things that she wants to talk about. Of course, her positions on this might be worth some some watching too. I guess she's a good candidate for that.
This is a one-off thing, Ukraine. What about Libya, Afghanistan, Syria? Like, again, I have to keep saying it in case we get pulled off the bloody internet. I don't think like Putin's a great guy. He's probably a total nutter. You know, he's in charge of a country. He's got nuclear bombs. He's been in the KGB. He might be the worst dude ever. I don't know. But what I do know, he's in the country that we're allowed to vote in for all the good it'll do, yeah? He ain't in charge. It's these other dudes that are always lying to us and telling us how nice they are and how different they are. When Democratic Senator Chris Coons issued one of the first in what's sure to be a long list of official calls for more direct US involvement in the Ukraine conflict, saying Vladimir Putin will only stop when we stop him. Yeah, that's how they've changed the conversation, isn't it? We've got to do something, we've got to do it. And then it just becomes in the end, all right, this is what we're doing, is it? The only serious major media
I mean, okay.
pushback came from Tucker Carlson on Fox. Tucker Carlson, who probably 10 years ago, oh, this Tucker Carlson dude, he's all right wing, I'm not interested in him. Now you think, you listen to him, all right, I don't agree with him when he talks about homelessness or maybe some identity politics stuff, but when he's talking about corporate power, state media, propaganda, you think, what? Kind of agree with the dude, man. It's not that Fox is a paradise of enlightened pacifism. Yeah, that's not going to be their new tagline. Fox, a paradise of enlightened pacifism. We're against war at all costs because we've become spiritually awakened. We can see that only love is real, our personal identity and ego is temporary, and all conflicts, whether individual, cultural, or international, are as a result of the kind of egoic thinking that we at Fox stand against as we try to achieve this paradise of love and unity. That ain't Fox, is it?
If anything, if I may address the transcendental thoughts here, I don't think the war is actually. War is collective thinking more than anything else. So it would transcend ego in a terrible way, but I don't think he's actually right about the egotistic thinking that causes the war to happen. Maybe he didn't give it enough thought. About Fox, Fox actually made a hard U-turn. Fox was against the whole thing initially. Fox was very supportive of Putin initially, and it's only when the war started that they did the U-turn, and now they're hawkish. So I don't think they were super consistent on that. I'm not sure what Tucker, I'm pretty sure Tucker was kind of the same on that, but the others definitely were talking about Putin being a strong leader and so on.
Ain't, but they're doing better than some of the "we're so nice" crew. But that the centre-left media landscape is a total desert when it comes to dissent from NatSec, or national security, I reckon, conventional wisdom. A consumer who only reads traditional press will see Ukraine coverage confined to the following parameters. Should we stick with just sanctions and sending arms, or up the ante? One of Chomsky's famous lessons is the function of the mainstream political media stratagem is to keep your views confined to a tiny little box. Oh, should it be sanctions or should we up the ante? What about like come to some sort of deal or something, some kind of peace? How about we reorganize our whole country?
Yeah, if you just drop the weapons, stop resisting, and then this will be over really soon. Sure, yeah. We'll kill your territorial defense people like in Bucha. We'll rape your women like we did also in Bucha and other places. But yeah, if you would just stop resisting, demilitarize yourself, denazify yourself, maybe topple your own government, maybe bring somebody pro-Russian to be president, it's going to be okay after that. I mean, what else can we do? What other options are there? What negotiations? How does he imagine this happening?
Sanctions or up the ante? Oh no, up the ante. Yes! That's what you was meant to say. There's up the ante, guys. They're all into it. Viewers see journalists asking 100 times a day if we're involved enough or sending enough arms. You've got to stop watching that stuff. Start watching it. Just watch this. We'll do our best. We'll make mistakes. But, you know, you'll get a glittery outfit out of me once in a while. The bulk of American news followers probably aren't even aware that Zelensky has asked the US for diplomatic aid. I wasn't aware. Or the headlines are about Zelensky asking for weapons or sanctions. I would like some diplomatic aid or weapons or sanctions. Weapons! Yeah, the weapons are coming. We're going to send you lethal aid. I said diplomatic aid. Lethal. We heard you the first time. Nice and lethal. Drink your...
Sure. I mean, ideally, the West would pressure Russia into negotiating. I mean, obviously that hasn't worked, right? So what else can we do? If you can't talk with somebody who's hitting you on the head, there's only a limited range of options to your disposal, right?
Lethal aid now. We'll even lend you the money to pay for it. Even if there's a sentence buried in some of the texts about diplomatic help, fewer stories have explained that the United States seems to have declined to participate in peace talks or empower Zelensky to negotiate an end to sanctions. So that sounds like there's an intended outcome. They're not trying to look at all possible outcomes. Right, okay.
So this is not true. I mean, the US has said that they would follow Ukraine's lead if Ukraine wants to do whatever Ukraine wants to do. I think there was even a phrase of, we're not going to be more Ukrainian than Ukrainians and the Ukrainians. So I'm not sure where this is coming from.
Jesus, they're trying to negotiate with these guys, see if we can end this war and suffering as soon as possible, given that's what we're telling everyone we're trying to.
There is literally no way of ending this war as soon as possible other than going through it. There is nothing we can do. Russia is attacking Ukraine as we speak. They have to be stopped in some way. They're not going to stop unless Ukraine surrenders. If that's your idea of negotiations, okay, then you can say that. But don't say, let's negotiate as if that's something we can do without surrendering.
To do. But if it turns out Putin is an absolute nutter and that, I mean, God, with heavy hearts, we'll have to wade into some terrible war that's going to cost loads of lives and make loads of money for people, just as a byproduct. But first, let's check all available options. Even fewer have pointed to the growing number of comments from current and former American officials suggesting the US should draw Russia into a long military quagmire that could weaken the enemy in the long run. This is the model that people are now looking toward, an unpleasantly smiling Hillary Clinton said on CNN not long ago.
Okay, so I have to admit, unpleasantly smiling Hillary Clinton is pretty funny. And also, this is kind of true. I think if we're talking about the interest of NATO here, I think NATO wouldn't want this to end super quickly. Then NATO would like to have Russia as weakened as possible to ensure security of NATO members, because NATO is looking after NATO members. That is the purpose of NATO. So in the interest of NATO, clearly is, since we have Russia that's very militaristic and aggressive, is Russia as weak as possible.
Remember, Julian Assange, who's been treated so fairly since the revelations he made, said that the point of the Afghanistan war was not to have a conflict where you get in and mess them up and do, help everyone and women's rights and all that. The point was to get in there and have a long, turgid, ongoing, profitable conflict that lasts for 20 years. As he said, Assange, the point.
Yeah, I don't buy this at all. I think that there was definitely incentive. So the bureaucracy, the military industrial complex, they were incentivized to, of course, not end the war. But I don't think anybody who actually made any decisions knowingly, including the military, knowingly extended the war. I think these things just happened by groupthink, bureaucracy, poor planning, not thinking through, not defining objectives, and so on, which seems to be the mainstream explanation. I have no reason to doubt that explanation, although it's super convenient. I'm sure, again, the defense industry didn't do a lot to stop the war, of course.
Of government is to transfer public money, that's your money, into private corporate hands. Just so if ever you see that template playing out, at least query what's going on. If you're
there are a lot of people in the US working for the defense industry, so that money is coming to actual people. There's reason why certain representatives in Congress constantly vote for tanks that nobody asked for and things like that. It's because they're representing states that are heavily dependent on the defense contractors. And they have jobs, and that puts bread on the table. And that's exactly what we talk about when we say military industrial complex. So it's a little bit more difficult than just the private pockets of the corporations, as if they're not made of people.
on the wrong side of the national security consensus, or even if you just want to suggest that alternative policy ideas exist. You won't make it near the press mainstream now. Policing on this issue is significantly more intense than it was even in the virtual unanimity of the pre-Iraq period. Moreover, as Freddie de Boer just noted on Substack, even people who define themselves by championing dissent and free speech are no less likely to demand that everyone get on board with the dominant narrative. Yeah, I've noticed that. People that are super kind of like, listen, normally I don't like the government and all that, but let's jump on board with those guys. Why is war the final bastion of towing the line with the state and the media? Where are all the dissenting voices that usually exist that point out institutional bigotry and prejudice? Where have they gone? In addition to Matt Taibbi's article, let's look at a few additional points about the mainstream media when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Cable news viewership has significantly jumped during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Okay. Since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, cable news networks have routinely called on defense officials turned consultants to offer analysis and help the American public make sense of the crisis. Often these analysts have used their TV time to call for greater US involvement and bolder moves. The networks have consistently failed to disclose these analysts' day jobs, describing them instead only by their former high-ranking military or government roles. This guy, he used to be in the army. What does he do now? Look, he used to be in the army. If you don't put that someone's day job is that they work for an arms manufacturer, you focus instead on their military credentials, that's editorializing. That's leading you to a particular conclusion. That means you've got an agenda.
Kind of. I mean, it wouldn't. I don't think there's a lot of malice here. I think they're just kind of pointing out their credentials, right? It wouldn't increase their credibility to be working for an arms company or something, right? What people care about is that there's an expert who used to be this army person, right? A general or whatever, and they're talking about the war. And that's what people care about. I don't think the information would be useful. Although you could argue that they could disclose that. I don't think it's malicious the way that Russell is trying to represent it. However, it's true. Yes, people are watching news more when there's something terrible happening, like this war. And there's a ton of generals, former generals, etc., who are basically, they're all saying the same thing because it's kind of clear in terms of what's actually happening on the ground, what needs to be done. I'm not sure that they're pushing for their actual businesses that they're employed by. I think it's just a very convenient benefit of what's going on. But I think even if you would have those generals not employed by those defense contractors, I'm sure not all of them are, you would still have them saying the same thing. I think they're pretty much correct in their assessment based on the information they have.
Ukraine crisis and the potential for greater conflict have been a goldmine for defence contractors, sending stocks skyrocketing and prompting sharp increases in defence spending. Now, look, what people will say is sort of like, how dare you, how dare you? But do you remember during the pandemic, these kind of conversations? Do you remember them? Do you remember in the Iraq War? Do you remember them? It's like we can't always be one story behind reality, can we? No, not this time. No, the pandemic's a legit thing. Oh, no, the Iraq War. Oh, no, the Ukraine War. Like, you know, again, I'm not suggesting that it's not a horrific conflict and there isn't immeasurable suffering, but I am saying that when you have systems that are dominated by corporate interest, if corporate interests benefit, then it's likely that their agenda will be undertaken. That doesn't seem that mad. That's not, is it? In the wake of...
No, but again, I think it's just a convenient benefit of the fact that they're employed by these companies. One could argue that if they really wanted to increase sales, they would all push for more NATO involvement, which would increase the demand for modern weapons. What's happening now is Europe and the US are basically providing junk, older junk to Ukraine. Only now we have seen Only recently we have seen actual modern weapons. Everything else, everything that was provided before was just, like Cold War era weapons that the newer NATO members like Poland, etc., had. So these generals, if they're shells for the military-industrial complex, I think they're doing a pretty bad job, right?
Russia's invasion, President Biden signed into law a spending package that directs a record-breaking $782 billion towards defense, almost $30 billion above his initial request. I wonder why he would have done that. 51 members of Congress and their spouses own up to $5.8 million worth of defense contractor stocks. This is what I reckon. For me to toe the line, right, you'd have to clear this shit up. That's what you'd have to do. I'd toe the line. If it's like the mainstream media ain't bothered about viewers, you're not got Lockheed Martin pundits on, the networks are being open and honest about their sources, we're not allowing any stocks to rocket as a result, we've put a cap on that, there's no profit to be made from it, Biden's spending packages are responsible, no one in Congress is allowed to own stocks in defense contracts, and finally, the average US taxpayer contributed about $2,000 to the military last year, according to a breakdown by the Institute for Policy Studies. More than $900 of that went to corporate military contractors. Isn't it brilliant? Isn't it brilliant how they always make you think you've got to support the military, and you have the image of brave men and women in combat fatigues doing tireless work of duty and patriotism and love and service and community. But actually, the reality is a significant portion, nearly half of that, goes to corporate military contractors. Your money, not the government's money. Their money's tied up in stocks for the same military contractors. Well, what an amazing situation. So I'll toe the line. I'll get out there with any flags and trumpets and whatever. I'll sign up. But
again, so there's a ton of people actually working for those military contractors. It's not as if it's the same thing like when people talk about healthcare and they talk about this huge healthcare industry, insurance industry takes all this money and it goes somewhere. It doesn't go to the cloud. It doesn't go to the matrix. It goes to people who are employed by the industry, and the industry is huge. People earn their living by working in the industry, so they vote to preserve that. So that's why it's so hard to change anything there. And it's the same thing here. Defense is a huge industry. And it's very hard to reduce it. It's very hard to say, okay, let's reduce the budget. And of course, there will be a tendency for the budget to explode when there is a potential for basically a third world war. No matter what we do, there's this possibility that Putin will just do it. So, of course you have to invest in defense, especially now that you have this new... You have a ton of new information about Russia, that they're very, very different from what we thought. And that sheds new light on Russia. It sheds new light on China as well. I can totally understand the argumentation for the new budget, although the numbers are crazy.
Wouldn't it be nice to know that there is moral and ethical integrity, that there is no opportunity for profit, that the main players are behaving responsibly? That would make a difference for me. Would it make a difference for you? Let me know in the comments below what you think. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at one of these ones.
Okay, guys, so this was kind of not super smart. These takes are very similar to both Jimmy Dore and Tucker. So that tells you that, yeah, these people are, it doesn't matter if they're leftist, progressive, conservative, if you're on the Russia talking point train, then you're on that same train with everybody else. And the talking points seem to be very similar. They have different emphasis on things, but I'm sure both Jimmy Dore and Tucker would talk about the same issue with the military-industrial complex and so on, and who's incentivized and so on and so on. So yeah, okay. I mean, there is a conversation to be had about that, but this is definitely not it. So I'm a little disappointed that we didn't really have a lot of actual good arguments and deeper thoughts, other than hey, who's interested here? Whose financial interest is it? Is it the generals on TV? Is it somebody else? And to to be fair to Russell, he didn't really justify Russia a lot. He didn't try to justify their actions, but he is under the illusion that we can negotiate, which unfortunately we can't. I wish we could. So anyway, that's it for this time. Well, I'll see who I'm gonna review next in this cringe fest. So take care.